I got fined $500 for hunting in the woods behind my cabin. Woods I thought were mine. Turns out they'd been lying about who owned that land for over 20 years. So yeah, I ended up buying the entire forest just to shut them up. Honestly, I still don't know if that was bold or just petty on an expensive scale. Either way, it was worth every dime. Ever had to deal with a power-hungry HOA? Drop a comment and tell me, because something tells me this nonsense isn't just happening in my zip code. Welcome to QA Stories. Buckle up. The HOA fined me for hunting in what I thought was my own backyard forest. Part of me wonders if I should have just paid that ticket and kept my head down. But when someone tells you your dream isn't really yours, it's hard to stay quiet. That's when I discovered they'd been lying about owning it for 20 years. So I bought the entire forest out from under them and banned Denise and her whole HOA board from ever setting foot on my property again. This is the story of how a $500 hunting fine turned into me owning 43 acres of woodland and watching the neighborhood bully pack up and move away. Sometimes the best revenge is just following the law better than the people trying to break it. And honestly, I'm curious, tell me where you're watching from, because I have a feeling this kind of HOA drama happens everywhere in America. Let me paint you a picture of what I thought was going to be my dream retirement setup. After 30 years as a landscape architect in Denver, I finally saved enough to buy this beautiful log cabin that backed right up to 40 acres of pristine forest. There were nights, back in Denver, when I'd fall asleep to YouTube videos of wind through trees. Just white noise to most people. To me, it was the sound of possibility. The listing specifically mentioned direct forest access as a major selling point, and honestly, that's why I paid the extra $50,000 for this property. I mean, who wouldn't want to wake up every morning and look out at untouched wilderness? I'd been dreaming about this for years, having my own little slice of nature where I could hunt, hike, and just escape from the world whenever I needed to. My name's Nate Harper, I'm 39 years old, and I love the outdoors more than almost anything else in life. Growing up in Colorado, hunting wasn't just a hobby, it was part of who I was. My dad taught me to track deer when I was 12, and some of my best memories are those early morning hunts where it was just me, the forest, and the quiet satisfaction of providing food for my family. I still remember the smell of pine on my dad's old hunting jacket. That worn-out thing had more stories than most people I know. So when I found this house, with its direct access to what looked like untouched woodland, I thought I'd found paradise. I wasn't even sure why I was so excited about it at the time, but looking back, I think it represented everything I'd been working toward my whole adult life. It wasn't just land. It was legacy, escape, pride. I didn't even realize how badly I needed it until someone tried to take it away. Saturday morning in late September, I'm out there tracking a beautiful 8-point buck through what I genuinely believed was my backyard forest. I'd done my homework, checked my property lines on the county website, got my Colorado hunting license renewed, studied the local hunting regulations. Everything seemed totally legitimate. Then this woman appears out of nowhere, like some kind of property rights superhero, except she's clearly the villain in this story. Her name was Denise Harrow, and she looked exactly like what you'd expect from an HOA president. Perfectly styled gray hair, designer hiking boots that had obviously never seen actual hiking, and this clipboard that she carried like a weapon. Behind her was this young police officer who looked about as confused as I felt. "This forest is under HOA management," she announced like she was reading me my rights. "Hunting here is strictly prohibited and violates our community standards." I'm standing there holding my valid Colorado hunting license, looking at land that literally backs up to my house, completely baffled by what was happening. Seriously? Did she really just claim authority over what I thought was my own property? The officer reluctantly handed me a $500 citation for unauthorized hunting on community property. I felt my stomach drop. Not like fear, more like vertigo, like the ground I thought was mine just shifted under my boots. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but standing there holding that ticket felt like being sucker punched by my own neighborhood. For exactly 5 seconds, I actually thought I was wrong about everything. Maybe I'd misunderstood something fundamental about property ownership in HOA communities. Maybe I was the idiot here. But then I looked around at these woods I'd been dreaming about for months, literally the reason I'd chosen this specific house, and one question hit me like lightning. Who actually owns this place? The smug satisfaction on Denise's face as she watched me get cited told me everything I needed to know about her motivations. This wasn't about community safety or wildlife protection. This was about power, pure and simple. And if there's one thing I absolutely cannot stand, it's bullies who abuse whatever tiny authority they've been given. That night, I spread out every single document from my home purchase on my kitchen table. Property surveys, HOA covenants, deed restrictions, title insurance papers, all of it. I'm a landscape architect, which means reading property documents is literally part of my job, so I know how to interpret legal descriptions. And that's when I noticed the first major inconsistency that would eventually change everything. My property description clearly mentioned forest access and usage rights, but the HOA bylaws claimed total management authority over all community green spaces. Looking back, I should have known right then that something was seriously wrong, because in my professional experience, those two things don't usually coexist peacefully. The more I dug into the paperwork, the more questions I had. When exactly did the HOA gain management rights over this forest? What company originally developed this land? And why were there references to something called Wildwood Estates, Inc. in my deed, but nowhere in the current HOA documentation? I went to bed that night with a choice that would change everything. Pay the fine and forget about it like a good neighbor, or dig deeper and risk becoming that guy who fights every little thing. But here's the thing. When you're trained to read land use documents for a living, certain inconsistencies jump out at you like neon signs. And these inconsistencies were practically screaming at me that something was very, very wrong. I wasn't sure if I had a legal leg to stand on. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let Denise rewrite the map of my life without at least checking the footnotes. I spent the next week doing what any reasonable person would do, trying to understand what I'd actually gotten myself into. I reread my purchase agreement line by line, studied the HOA bylaws until my eyes hurt, and honestly, I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid or if I was actually onto something legitimate. My deed clearly stated forest access and usage rights in perpetuity, but the HOA claimed exclusive management authority. In my professional experience, these two things don't usually coexist peacefully, and I kept wondering if I was missing something obvious or if everyone else was just accepting a situation that didn't make legal sense. I decided to attend the next HOA monthly meeting, not to cause drama, but just to understand the rules better. Looking back, that was probably my first big mistake. The meeting was held in Denise's living room, which should have been red flag number 1. The air inside her house was cold in that artificial way, central AC blasting like she was freezing out dissent. She sat behind this massive oak desk like she was presiding over a corporate boardroom instead of a neighborhood association with maybe 30 houses. When I politely asked about the forest boundaries and management authority, Gary Thompson, this older retired teacher who seemed reasonable, started to answer with what sounded like useful information. Well, originally those woods belonged to individual property owners when the development was first built, and the HOA sort of inherited management responsibility when Gary began. But Denise cut him off so fast, you'd think he was about to reveal state secrets. "Gary's confused about the timeline," she said with this dismissive tone that made my skin crawl. The HOA has always... Gary's lips kept moving even after Denise cut him off, like he'd rehearsed a truth and wasn't sure what to do with it now. But I caught something in Gary's eyes. This look like he desperately wanted to say more, but couldn't. Like someone who knows a secret but is too scared to tell it. I actually had to stop and stare at her after that interruption, because the whole exchange felt so obviously scripted and defensive. After the meeting, I approached Chloe Davis, a software engineer who'd moved in about 6 months before me. She seemed like the only person in that room who wasn't either terrified of Denise or completely buying into her authority complex. Over coffee, Chloe dropped a bombshell that completely changed my understanding of the situation. "You know, there was another homeowner who asked questions about those property lines about a year ago," she said, glancing around like she was worried someone might overhear us. She kept glancing over her shoulder, not dramatically, just subtle, like someone who'd already learned once not to ask too many questions. Really nice family with 2 kids. They seemed super upset about something involving the forest boundaries. "What happened to them?" I asked, and I had this sinking feeling that I already knew the answer wasn't going to be good. "They suddenly decided to move," Chloe said with this expression like she still couldn't believe it herself. "Put their house on the market within a month of asking those questions. The whole thing was weird. They'd just finished renovating their kitchen. That's when I realized I wasn't the first person to notice these inconsistencies, but I might be the first one stubborn enough not to be scared away by whatever pressure Denise was capable of applying. I started spending my lunch breaks at the Jefferson County Courthouse, digging through public property records. It was a weird kind of madness, chasing ghosts through old filing cabinets, hoping one of them still had something to say. The records were publicly available, but confusing as hell, with lots of references to this Wildwood Estates Inc. company that kept showing up in original land surveys from the 1980s, but wasn't mentioned anywhere in current HOA documentation. Even stranger, there were several boundary disputes from the early 2000s that seemed to involve this mysterious company, but all the cases appeared to have been quietly settled without any public resolution. That weekend, I walked the forest boundaries again, this time with my professional surveyor's eye. The land that Denise claimed was community property under HOA management didn't match up with any of the official boundary descriptions I'd found. Monday morning brought an email that made my coffee taste bitter. A formal notice from the HOA secretary, obviously written by Denise, stating that my continued questions about established HOA authority were disruptive to community harmony and that further challenges to legitimate management decisions could result in additional fines. The message was crystal clear. Shut up and pay your fine, or we'll make your life absolutely miserable. But here's the thing about being threatened by bullies. It usually just makes me more determined to find out what they're hiding. I actually had to laugh at the language they used because it sounded like something out of a dystopian novel. By the end of that week, I had a working theory that both scared and excited me. What if the HOA didn't actually own or have legal authority over the forest they claimed to manage? What if Denise had been bluffing about her power this whole time, and I was just the first person crazy enough to call her on it? It seemed almost impossible to believe, because how could an entire neighborhood association operate for decades based on false authority? But then again, I've learned that the most unbelievable explanations often turn out to be the most accurate ones. The question was, did I have the courage to find out for sure, or was I about to make the biggest mistake of my suburban life? Monday morning brought an email that made my hands shake. An official letter from Henderson & Associates, attorneys at law, on behalf of the HOA, demanding immediate payment of my hunting fine plus an additional $200 in administrative penalties for continued non-compliance. I Googled terms from the letter like I was studying for a bar exam I hadn't signed up for. Every phrase sounded worse the second time I read it. The legal language was deliberately intimidating. Terms like property violations, community disruption, and potential civil litigation with liens against your property jumping off the page like threats designed to scare me into submission. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt genuinely scared. I mean, legal bills can destroy people financially, and I had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. Sitting in my kitchen, reading that lawyer letter for the fourth time, I started to seriously question my own sanity. Maybe I had fundamentally misunderstood something about property ownership in HOA communities. Maybe Denise was right about everything, and I was just too proud and stubborn to admit I'd made a mistake. What if I'm completely wrong about all of this? The thought kept bouncing around my head. What if I'm turning into one of those neighbors who fights every minor inconvenience because they can't handle being told they're wrong? I'd seen men like that before, neighbors who turned parking disputes into holy wars, guys who made everyone's life miserable because they couldn't accept that sometimes you have to compromise. Looking back, I don't know if I was being too proud or too paranoid, but the isolation was starting to get to me. Chloe called that Tuesday to tell me she was taking a step back from our conversations about the HOA situation. I'm really sorry, Nate, but I can't afford to get caught up in this drama right now. Work is insane and I just need to keep my head down. She didn't owe me anything, but I still felt like I'd been abandoned mid-fight, like calling in air support and getting voicemail. I understood her position completely, but it stung like hell to lose my only ally in the neighborhood. Fighting this battle alone felt 10 times harder than I'd expected. That's when I decided to bite the bullet and call Miles Brennan, a real estate attorney I'd worked with on a commercial landscaping project 2 years earlier. If I was going to continue this fight, I needed to know whether I had any legal ground to stand on or if I was just throwing money at a fantasy. Miles agreed to review my documents for a $500 consultation fee. Bring me everything, he said. Property deed, HOA bylaws, the citation, any correspondence. I'll tell you if you're crazy, or if you're onto something legitimate. While I waited for Miles to review my case, Denise ramped up the pressure, like she was trying to break me psychologically. Suddenly, I was getting violation notices for everything imaginable. My grass was allegedly too long, which it wasn't. I'd literally mowed it 3 days earlier. My mailbox was improperly positioned, even though it had been in the exact same spot for 8 months. My outdoor security light was excessive and disruptive to neighbors, despite being just one motion sensor. Each fine was relatively small, $50 here, $75 there, but the psychological message was crystal clear. Comply with our authority or we'll micromanage your life into absolute misery. The worst part was feeling constantly watched. The same white SUV passed my house 3 times in an hour. Once it even slowed when I took the trash out. I waved. No one waved back. HOA board members started driving by my house multiple times a day, slowing down, taking notes, making it obvious they were documenting everything I did. One morning, I caught Gary Thompson actually photographing my property from the street with a professional-looking camera. And when I waved at him, he looked absolutely mortified and drove away so fast he probably broke the speed limit. I actually had to stop and stare at the whole situation because it felt like I was living in some kind of authoritarian nightmare. Thursday evening, I found myself standing in my backyard, staring at the forest where this whole nightmare had started, seriously considering whether I should just surrender. The stress was affecting my work performance, my sleep, my ability to enjoy the house I'd bought specifically for its peaceful setting. I remember thinking, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she's right. Maybe the paperwork's confusing for a reason. But then I saw the deer. Same one from that morning, just watching. And I knew I couldn't give in. Maybe they're right, I thought. Maybe I should just accept that this is how HOA communities work and stop fighting battles I can't win. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to pay the damn fines and move on with my life, because we're talking about maybe $800 total, pocket change compared to what a legal battle could cost. But then I remembered why I'd bought this house in the first place. The forest access, the hunting opportunities, the freedom to enjoy nature without someone with a clipboard telling me I couldn't. I wish I could tell you I had some brilliant moment of clarity, but honestly, I was just too stubborn to give up. Maybe that makes me an idiot, but sometimes being too stubborn to quit is the only thing that separates the people who win from the people who get crushed. Friday afternoon at 4:30 p.m., Miles Brennan called with news that completely altered the trajectory of this entire situation. "Nate, I need you to sit down for this conversation," he said, and I could tell from his tone that whatever he discovered was going to be significant. "Because what I found in your property records is either the biggest clerical error I've encountered in 20 years of real estate law, or your HOA has been operating under completely false authority for decades." My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. After weeks of self-doubt, escalating harassment, and questioning my own sanity, I finally had hope again. But Miles' tone told me this discovery was bigger than just my hunting citation. This was about something that could potentially change everything. Monday morning, I met Miles at his downtown office, where he had documents spread across his conference table like evidence in a criminal investigation. "Nate, before we start, tell me everything you know about a company called Wildwood Estates, Inc., Miles said. "Just that the name keeps appearing in old property records I found at the courthouse," I replied. "I assumed it was some previous development company that went out of business years ago." Miles nodded grimly and slid a thick folder across the table. "It was a development company, and according to every legal document I can find, they still technically own the forest your HOA claims to manage." I just stared at the folder, not really reading, just trying to process what he'd said. This wasn't a missing signature. This was decades of false authority. My brain struggled to process what he'd just said. Still own it? How is that even possible? Miles pulled out a copy of an original deed from 1987. Wildwood Estates, Inc. purchased 43 acres of woodland for a planned residential expansion that never materialized. The company went bankrupt in 1995, but here's where it gets interesting. The property was never sold or transferred to pay creditors. He showed me bankruptcy court records that looked like they belonged in a legal thriller. When companies go bankrupt, their assets typically get liquidated to pay debts, but this particular asset somehow fell through the cracks. The land has been sitting in legal limbo for almost 30 years. "To who actually owns it now?" I asked, feeling like I was about to learn something that would change everything. "Technically, still Wildwood Estates, Inc., even though they're a defunct company that exists only on paper. The bankruptcy was never properly closed, which means the company still exists in a legal sense. The legal jargon was flying over my head. Reorganization code, dormant entities, title trail. But underneath all that, one sentence screamed in my brain. They never owned it. Miles pulled out another stack of documents, the original HOA formation papers from 1998. Your HOA was established 3 years after Wildwood went bankrupt. Someone told them they had management authority over community green spaces, including this forest, but there's no legal documentation supporting that claim. But if Wildwood still owns it, I started to say, and Miles finished the thought. Then the HOA has been managing property they have absolutely no legal right to control. Every rule they've made about forest access, every fine they've issued, every threat they've made, it's all been based on authority they never possessed in the first place. The magnitude of what Miles was telling me hit like a freight train. Can you prove this in court? I asked, because the whole situation seemed too unbelievable to be true. I already have, Miles said with confidence. The paper trail is ironclad. You know, I used to watch these crazy property dispute stories on drama channels online, but I never imagined I'd be living through one myself. The kind of situation where reality gets so bizarre that fiction writers would reject it as too unbelievable. Miles leaned back in his chair with an expression I couldn't quite read. Now, here's where this gets really interesting. We have several options for how to proceed. Such as, I asked, we could challenge your fines in court, demand the HOA acknowledge their mistake, maybe get you some compensation. That's the traditional approach, Miles explained. Or, I prompted. For the first time that morning, Miles smiled. Or, we could do something that would permanently solve this problem in a way that would give you complete control over the situation forever. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked, wondering if I was about to hear the most creative legal strategy of my life. Wildwood Estates Inc. is essentially a dormant shell company with one remaining asset, that forest. Since the bankruptcy was never properly closed, the company technically still exists and can be purchased by anyone willing to pay fair market value. It felt absurd, like a joke you tell at a bar. Oh, they fined me? I'll just buy the company that owns the land. Only this wasn't a joke, it was an option, a real one. I stared at him like he'd just suggested I buy the moon. You're saying I could buy the entire company that owns the forest? I'm saying you could purchase Wildwood Estates Inc., gain complete legal ownership of the forest, and then establish your own rules about who gets access. Forever. The audacity of the idea left me speechless. From being fined for hunting in my woods to potentially owning the entire forest outright. Is that actually legal? I asked. Completely legal. Bankruptcy asset purchases happen regularly. The process involves tracking down creditors, getting court approval, and paying fair market value. What kind of money are we talking about? I asked, doing mental math on my savings. Based on comparable land sales in your area, probably between $300,000 and $400,000, plus legal fees and court costs. I sat there calculating my available resources, savings, retirement accounts, home equity, and realized that while it would be a massive financial commitment, it wasn't impossible. How long would this process take? 6 to 8 weeks if everything goes smoothly. But here's the thing, once we file the purchase paperwork, it becomes public record. The HOA will find out what you're doing, and they're going to fight this with everything they've got. I thought about Denise's reaction when she discovered that not only was I challenging her authority, but I was actually trying to buy the property she'd been illegally managing for decades. Before committing to anything this dramatic, I decided to give Denise one last opportunity to be reasonable. I called her that afternoon. Denise, I've been doing some research about the forest property boundaries, and I think there might be some confusion about the legal basis for the HOA's management authority. I didn't call to threaten her, I was giving her a chance. One last off-ramp before the crash, but her voice? Cold steel. She'd already doubled down. Her response was immediate and hostile. There's no confusion whatsoever, Nate. The HOA manages all community green spaces, period. If you're trying to find some legal loophole to avoid paying your legitimate fines, you're wasting everyone's time. Her arrogance and refusal to even consider that she might be wrong sealed the deal for me. Tuesday morning, I called Miles back. Let's do it. Let's buy Wildwood Estates Inc. Are you absolutely certain? Once we start this process, there's no backing down quietly. This is going to become very public, very quickly. I wasn't angry, not exactly. What I felt was colder, focused. I didn't just want to win, I wanted the truth. In ink, on paper, filed with the court. I thought about her dismissive attitude, the harassment campaign, the intimidation tactics, and all the other homeowners who'd been bullied into silence over the years. I'm sure, let's buy ourselves a forest. As I hung up the phone, I realized I'd just committed to the most expensive act of principle in my entire life. But was it principle or just very expensive spite? I guess I was about to find out which one costs more. Miles filed the initial paperwork to begin the Wildwood Estates purchase process that Wednesday morning. There was something strange about signing documents that might change the fate of a neighborhood at a UPS store near a subway. The court requirements were straightforward but time-consuming. Notify all potential creditors, get an independent property appraisal, submit our purchase offer, and wait for judicial approval. This will take about 6 weeks, Miles explained. But once we file these documents, they become public record. The HOA will find out what you're doing. I decided to keep it quiet for now, figuring Denise would react dramatically enough when she discovered what we were doing. While the legal machinery ground forward, I decided to reconnect with Gary Thompson. Something about his interrupted comment at that HOA meeting had been bothering me for weeks. I found him working in his garden one evening and struck up what I hoped seemed like a casual conversation. Gary, you mentioned something at the meeting about the forest originally belonging to individual property owners. Can you tell me more about that? He looked around nervously, like Denise might be hiding behind a tree with her clipboard. His hands were shaking a little, not from fear, maybe, just from the weight of 15 years of silence suddenly cracking open. I probably shouldn't have said anything. Denise gets really upset when we discuss old HOA business. I'm not trying to cause trouble, I'm just trying to understand how property management works around here. Gary set down his gardening tools and really looked at me for the first time. You're the one who's been asking all those questions about property boundaries, aren't you? Guilty as charged, I admitted. He was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with something internal. Then, can I trust you to keep something confidential? I nodded, and what Gary told me next confirmed everything I'd suspected. When I first joined the HOA board 15 years ago, there were ongoing discussions about those woods. Denise was already president then, and she told us the HOA had inherited clear management rights from the previous developer. But I remember seeing documents that didn't quite match her explanation. There were references to a company called Wildwood something or other, and questions about whether we actually had legal authority or just assumed authority, based on tradition. What happened to those documents? I asked. Denise said they were outdated and confusing, so she had them removed from the official files. She said it was cleaner to just reference our current authority in the updated bylaws, rather than dwelling on ancient history. Gary looked genuinely troubled by the memory. I should have asked more questions back then, but Denise was so confident about everything and she said she'd consulted with attorneys. Gary, do you still have copies of any of those old documents? He hesitated for several seconds. I might have some things in my personal files at home. I'm a retired teacher. We never throw anything away. It's like a professional disease. 2 days later, Gary called with barely contained excitement. I found something you absolutely need to see. What Gary had discovered was a complete copy of the original HOA formation documents from 1998, including a legal memo from their first attorney that highlighted significant authority gaps regarding the Wildwood Estates property. The language was lawyer dry, but the meaning hit like a thunderclap. They knew. They'd always known. And they chose to act like they didn't. The memo specifically recommended clarifying ownership and management rights before assuming any enforcement responsibilities. That recommendation had obviously been completely ignored. Word was apparently getting around the neighborhood that I was researching property issues. Chloe called me Thursday evening, sounding worried. Nate, people are saying you're planning to sue the HOA. Is that true? Not exactly, but I am working to resolve the forest access issue permanently. Look, I'm really sorry I backed away from this before. The work pressure was real, but honestly, I also got scared when Denise started asking pointed questions about who I'd been talking to. She didn't apologize. She didn't have to. When someone comes back after the storm starts, that says more than any sorry ever could. She cornered you about our conversations. She cornered me after the neighborhood barbecue and asked if you'd been spreading conspiracy theories about HOA authority. She made it very clear that supporting disruptive residents could affect my standing in the community. That conversation confirmed what I'd suspected. Denise knew her position was vulnerable and she was trying to isolate me by intimidating potential allies. As word spread about my property research, Denise's harassment campaign escalated to almost comical levels. That week, I got cited for leaving my hose inadequately coiled. I didn't even know there was a standard for hose coiling. Maybe the Geneva Convention missed that one. I started getting violation notices for increasingly ridiculous infractions. My car was parked slightly outside acceptable boundaries in my own driveway. My trash can was visible from the street on collection day, which was literally the point, and my garden hose was improperly stored, even though it was coiled neatly next to my house. The psychological pressure was real, but it was also making me angry instead of scared, and angry me is a lot more dangerous than scared me. But something unexpected was happening. People didn't knock. They'd catch me by the mailbox, the grocery store, at gas stations. Little nods, small stories, like survivors comparing scars. Other homeowners started approaching me quietly, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach that they'd never felt safe discussing publicly. Tom Martinez told me about being fined $200 for planting roses in his front yard because they weren't on Denise's approved plant list. Sarah Chen described being threatened with legal action for hanging laundry in her own backyard. The thing is, Sarah confided, nobody wants to fight her because she makes life absolutely miserable for anyone who challenges her authority. It's easier to just comply and keep your head down. 3 weeks into the legal process, I met with Miles for a progress update. The purchase is proceeding smoothly. The court-appointed appraiser valued the property at $340,000, which is actually lower than we anticipated. Has anyone from the HOA contacted you yet? Not yet, but they'll find out soon enough when the ownership transfer gets recorded with the county. Miles leaned forward. Nate, what's your actual end game here? Once you own this property, you'll have complete legal control over forest access. What are you planning to do with that power? I'd been thinking about that question constantly. I want to establish fair, reasonable rules that actually make sense and serve legitimate purposes. And I want to make sure Denise can never again use fake authority to bully people. And if she tries to fight this legally, I thought about Gary's suppressed documents, all the homeowners who'd shared their intimidation stories, and the years of unchallenged abuse of power. Then she'll discover what it feels like to fight someone who actually has the legal authority she's been pretending to have for 20 years. The purchase approval came through on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, I would legally own the forest that Denise had been using as a weapon against the entire neighborhood. It was time to start planning my HOA meeting debut. That weekend, I kept staring at the forest through my kitchen window, knowing that in 72 hours, it would be legally mine. But owning it was just the beginning. The real question was, what happens when you give someone who's been bullied the power to fight back? Was I about to become the hero of this story, or was I just another bully with better paperwork? The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 p.m. in Denise's living room, and by Wednesday afternoon I legally owned 43 acres of forest and held the deed that would change everything. Miles had prepared a presentation folder with copies of all relevant documents, the original Wildwood Estates bankruptcy records, our purchase agreement, the new deed showing my ownership, and a legal opinion establishing that the HOA had never possessed any management authority. Remember, he told me, you don't need to be aggressive or dramatic. The facts will speak for themselves. Thursday evening, I walked into Denise's living room for what I knew would be either my greatest triumph or most spectacular humiliation. I could feel the sweat between my shoulder blades. Everyone was watching me. Not like a hero, not yet, more like a bomb that hadn't gone off. The usual suspects were there, Denise positioned behind her massive oak desk, like a Supreme Court justice, Gary looking nervous, 2 other board members, and about 8 homeowners including Chloe. Denise started with her typical agenda, then got to what she clearly considered the main event. Before we adjourn tonight, we need to address the ongoing situation with Mr. Harper, who continues to refuse payment of legitimate fines and has been spreading misinformation about established HOA authority. Denise had prepared what sounded like a rehearsed speech about community standards and the need for consequences when residents refuse to comply with legitimate authority. I let her finish completely. When she looked at me expectantly, I stood up calmly. Denise, before we continue this discussion, I'd like to clarify something about the legal basis for HOA authority over the forest area. There's nothing to clarify, Mr. Harper. The HOA manages all community green spaces, as clearly established in our governing documents and 20-plus years of precedent. I opened my folder and pulled out the Wildwood Estates bankruptcy records. My fingers fumbled slightly as I opened the folder. Not fear, just the tremor of years of frustration finding a voice. Actually, I think there is something important to clarify. Are you familiar with a company called Wildwood Estates, Inc.? For the first time since I'd known her, Denise looked genuinely uncertain. That was the previous development company. They've been out of business for decades and aren't relevant to current operations. Actually, they're extremely relevant, because according to county records and bankruptcy court documents, Wildwood Estates Inc. never transferred ownership of the forest property to anyone, including this HOA. I placed the bankruptcy documents on her desk where everyone could see them. These are the official bankruptcy records from 1995, showing that Wildwood Estates assets were never sold or transferred. The company went dormant, but it never stopped owning the forest. Denise picked up the papers, her face visibly paling. These are old documents that don't affect current management authority established through years of precedent. Actually, they do affect current authority, because as of Monday, I purchased Wildwood Estates Inc. and all its assets through the bankruptcy court. The room went completely silent. What that means is that I now legally own the 43 acres of forest that this HOA has been claiming to manage for over 20 years. Which means every fine issued for forest activities has been issued without any legal authority whatsoever. Denise shot to her feet like she'd been electrocuted. Her voice cracked halfway through fraud. For a second I thought she might cry, or scream, or both, but instead she stood there like someone watching their empire slip off a cliff. That's impossible. You can't just buy. We have attorneys. This is some kind of fraud. Nothing fraudulent about it. It's a standard bankruptcy asset purchase, approved by the county court. I pulled out the deed and legal opinion. This is my deed showing clear ownership, and this is a legal opinion from my attorney confirming that this HOA has never had any management authority over this property. Gary was staring at the documents like they were written in ancient hieroglyphics. Chloe looked like she was trying not to smile. The other homeowners were buzzing with shocked whispers. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Denise shouted, her composure completely shattered. "You can't just waltz in here and claim you own community property that's been managed by this association for decades." "I'm not claiming anything, Denise. I'm stating a legal fact that's verifiable through public records. This HOA doesn't own this property and never has. You've been managing it without any legal authority for over 20 years. "We'll fight this, we'll sue, we'll challenge this in court," she sputtered. "You'll what exactly? Challenge my legal ownership of property you can't prove you ever owned in the first place?" That's when Gary Thompson did something that shocked everyone in the room. He slowly stood up. He looked older than he had 10 minutes ago, like saying it out loud aged him. "Denise, I need to say something important." "Gary, sit down. We don't need to hear anything from you right now." "No, I really need to say this," Gary continued, finding courage he didn't know he had. "I remember those documents from 15 years ago, the ones you said were outdated and confusing, and had removed from our files. They raised serious questions about our authority over the Wildwood property." Gary turned to address the entire room. "I should have insisted we resolve those questions back then, instead of just accepting your assurances that everything was fine. That was my responsibility as a board member, and I failed." Denise was absolutely furious now, her face red with rage. "Gary, you have no idea what you're talking about. This man is trying to destroy our entire community." "Actually," I said, maintaining the same calm tone, "I'm trying to establish clear legal property rights, something that should have been done decades ago." I addressed the room directly. "For the record, I plan to allow reasonable forest access for community members under fair, clearly defined rules, but those will be my rules, established by the actual legal property owner." Then I looked directly at Denise. I wasn't sure if I should say it, but I did, slowly, carefully, like handing out a verdict. "Denise and anyone involved in the enforcement campaign are no longer welcome on my property. However, current HOA board members who participated in the harassment and illegal fining campaign will not be welcome on my property, effective immediately." It was quiet, not silent, a kind of stunned hush, like everyone had to rewire what they thought the rules were. The meeting completely dissolved into chaos, with Denise demanding to see more documents and threatening legal action. But the other homeowners were asking different questions. Does this mean our forest fines are invalid and we get our money back? As people filed out, several homeowners approached me privately to express support. Sarah Chen shook my hand and said, "Thank you for standing up to her. Someone needed to do this years ago." But I knew Denise well enough to predict that she wasn't going to accept this quietly. If anything, she was going to escalate this war to levels I couldn't even imagine. Walking to my car that night, I felt like I'd just detonated a nuclear bomb in the middle of suburbia. But here's the thing about nuclear explosions. You never know what's going to survive the blast until the radiation settles. And Denise? She looked like someone who would rather burn down the entire neighborhood than admit she'd been wrong for 20 years. The week following my HOA meeting revelation was absolute chaos in the best possible way. True to her word, Denise immediately hired an attorney to challenge my ownership claim. Their legal strategy was creative. They argued that the HOA had established adverse possession rights through 20 years of continuous management. When Miles told me they tried arguing adverse possession, I laughed so hard I spilled my coffee. So they squatted on the forest and think that counts? It was a bold theory that lasted exactly until Miles provided the court with documented evidence that the HOA had never actually managed the property beyond putting up a few signs and harassing people. Adverse possession requires active, exclusive, and continuous use, Miles explained. Issuing bogus fines doesn't come close to meeting that standard. The HOA's challenge was dismissed with what Miles called unusual prejudice, legal speak for this wasted the court's time. But Denise wasn't finished. She organized an emergency community meeting to rally support against my hostile takeover of community assets. She rented the local community center and sent flyers claiming I was attempting to steal community property through legal technicalities. About 40 people showed up, and Denise had prepared a PowerPoint presentation about protecting community interests. But something remarkable happened when she opened the floor for input. Instead of the outrage she expected, people started sharing their own stories about HOA overreach. Even people who'd once nodded politely at her started shifting uncomfortably. One man raised his hand and said, "My wife cried for 2 days after you fined her for her wreath." Tom Martinez stood up first. "You know what, Denise? I'm actually glad someone finally challenged your authority. You fined me $200 for planting roses in my front yard because they weren't on your approved plant list. That doesn't even exist in our bylaws." Sarah Chen followed, "And you threatened to put a lien on my house for hanging laundry in my backyard." Laundry? On my own property? One by one, neighbors voiced complaints that had been festering for years. The meeting that was supposed to rally support against me turned into a public airing of grievances against Denise's 2-decade reign of suburban tyranny. Meanwhile, the HOA's legal troubles were just beginning. Several homeowners started demanding refunds for fines they now realized had been issued without proper authority. Miles helped me draft a letter outlining their potential legal exposure. Issuing fines without proper authority could be considered harassment under Colorado law, and the HOA could be liable for damages beyond just refunding penalties. Once you establish they've been operating without legal authority for force issues, it calls into question every other fine they've taken, Miles explained. Their insurance company is going to be very unhappy. Sure enough, the HOA's insurance carrier got involved within 2 weeks. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was tired. Like I'd spent months digging out rot and now someone else finally smelled it too. The insurance company's attorneys took one look at the evidence and immediately recommended that the HOA settle all claims and implement procedures to verify legal authority before taking enforcement action. While Denise's world collapsed, I created forest access guidelines, simple, fair rules that actually made sense. Hunting permitted with valid licenses during season, hiking welcome year-round on marked trails, dog walking allowed with cleanup requirements. The key difference was that these guidelines were created by someone who actually had legal authority, and they applied equally to everyone. Well, almost everyone. The guidelines included one specific restriction. Access is permanently prohibited for former HOA board members who participated in the illegal harassment campaign, specifically including Denise Harrow and associated accomplices. I named names. Denise was banned for life from the property she'd claimed to control for 2 decades. The irony was so perfect it felt like cosmic justice. Gary Thompson was notably absent from the banned list for obvious reasons. When he called to thank me, I could hear genuine relief in his voice. With Denise's forest authority eliminated and her credibility destroyed, the HOA faced its first real leadership challenge in decades. A group of residents, led by Chloe, organized a special election to replace the board with members committed to transparency and actual legal authority. Gary was re-elected despite his years of passive compliance, largely because he'd found courage when it mattered most. "I want to help fix what I helped break," he told the community during his campaign speech. The new board implemented real transparency measures, published meeting minutes, clear procedures for rule changes, and verification of legal authority before taking enforcement actions. Faced with mounting legal bills and community hostility, Denise made her final decision. She resigned from the HOA board and put her house on the market. Her porch light stayed on for 2 nights after the moving truck left, empty, flickering, like a ghost waiting for someone to come home. Her resignation letter was a masterpiece of deflection, blaming outside agitators and legal technicalities while never once acknowledging she'd been managing property she didn't own. But her departure was a relief to virtually everyone. Even homeowners who'd initially supported her admitted the neighborhood felt more peaceful without her constant surveillance. On a personal level, the resolution exceeded my wildest expectations. The HOA sent me a formal letter acknowledging they had lacked proper legal authority for certain enforcement actions and included a check for $1,247, full reimbursement of all fines plus interest. But the real satisfaction came from the broader community transformation. The new HOA board operated with actual transparency. Neighbors started enjoying their properties without fear of arbitrary harassment, and property values increased as word spread about our reasonable HOA. 2 months after purchasing the forest, Colorado hunting season opened officially. I invited Tom Martinez, Sarah Chen's husband, and 2 other neighbors who'd been interested in hunting but intimidated by Denise's restrictions. It was a crisp November morning when we tracked deer through the same area where this saga had begun. We successfully harvested 2 deer that day, which we shared with neighborhood families. But more importantly, we had an incredible time enjoying nature without looking over our shoulders for clipboard-wielding HOA tyrants. 6 months later, my forest access program was working exactly as intended. The first time I saw kids hiking the trail with their dad, I just stood there behind the trees, smiling like an idiot. Families used the trails for hiking, responsible hunters followed seasonal guidelines, dog owners had a safe place to exercise their pets. Sarah Chen captured the community sentiment perfectly. It's amazing how much better everything works when the rules actually make sense and the person making them has real authority. Looking back, I learned several lessons about authority and community. Always verify authority. Documentation is everything. Bullies often collapse when challenged with facts. And sometimes the system works if you understand how to navigate it. This story ends exactly where it began, with me in the forest, but this time as its legal owner rather than a confused trespasser. Last weekend, I encountered the same family of deer that had started this adventure. Same wind, same woods, same silence. But this time it was mine, not just on paper. I exhaled slow and long, no one watching, no one chasing, just me, the forest, and peace. They looked at me calmly, assessed I wasn't a threat, and continued grazing peacefully. "You're all welcome to stay," I told them quietly. "This is your home too, and unlike the previous management, I actually have the authority to say that." The deer had never cared about property lines or HOA bylaws. They just wanted to live peacefully until someone with a clipboard showed up to cause unnecessary drama. I started all this just trying to hunt in peace, and somehow ended up buying a forest, rewriting the rules, and watching the neighborhood tyrant pack up and vanish. Wild, right? I didn't mean for any of it to happen, but bullies like Denise count on folks staying quiet. I guess I just got tired of pretending that fake authority was real. What started with a fine turned into a full-blown lesson in standing your ground. And yeah, maybe a little expensive spite. But if I had to do it again, I probably wouldn't change a thing. If you've ever dealt with an HOA power trip or had to fight tooth and nail for something that should have been simple, let me know in the comments. I read all of them. And if you liked this story, hit like or subscribe. There's more coming. If you want to help keep these stories going, you can tap that thanks button down below, only if you feel like it. No pressure. All right, see y'all next time.
That's it for now from QA Stories. Make sure you're subscribed and the bell's on. The next story might just top this one.